welcome to this event after the UN Water Conference examining the global dissonance. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Nahomi Urmachi. I'm a professor of environmental politics here at the Geography Department, King's College London. I'm also the co-director of the King's Water Centre. I'm sure many of you were actually in New York or followed the UN Water Conference online. There were many sessions that called for progress to be accelerated. We're not going to be meeting the SDG 6 goals at this rate. So there was a lot of emphasis on how we can speed up progress. But how do we really do that in a context of fragmented governance and how, as we cope with environmental change, urbanization, agricultural intensification, there are so many other intersecting issues with water that needs to be investigated. So today's discussion follows on from an earlier event that we had in March, revisiting the UN Water Conference, 46 years of learning and forgetting, that was hosted by Lila here and also by Alan, that critiqued the expectations and limitations of such large conferences. So today we aim for continued critical debate today. And by critical, what does that mean? So I propose 4 planks, which comes from a book that I wrote with my colleagues, Katie Meehan, Majed Akhtar, and Alex Loftus. And these 4 planks are around the idea that scarcity is made. Scarcity is not just something out there, that's something that just happens. That knowledge is power. That knowledge is imbued with power and power relationships. And these are part and parcel of the uneven relationships. Water is life. It's not just a purely economic good. It has cultural and other non-market values. And that the idea of camp is everywhere, that sites of resistance are everywhere. And these are where we really see the contestations of water that really need to be scrutinized. These 4 planks, I think, will help us offer some critical ways for looking at global water governance and not just critiquing for the sake of critiquing. If you are interested to know more about the 4 planks that I just mentioned, go and look for a book. It's available. So I strongly recommend you to take a look at it. But I'm also helped today with some brilliant speakers on our panel in person and online. And we'll continue this conversation as well as in Q&A with you. We'll have speakers make opening statements of about 5 minutes each, and then we'll open it to the floor. So please have your questions ready. We're using MS Teams today, which is perhaps unfamiliar to some of you. Certainly, it's a bit unfamiliar for me because of our college IT infrastructure. We have to use this. But please post your questions to the Q&A function, which you can find on the top banner of your screen if you are online. If you're in person, just give us a shout and the floor will be yours. If you are using a mobile phone or a web browser to log in today, you might not have the Q&A function, which is not the end of the world. Just raise your hand with the palm function, and then we'll unmute you and we'll be able to hear you so you can ask your questions directly. And I would say all the more, let's do that because it'll be nice to have an interactive dialogue with both in-person audiences and online audiences. I'd like to start introducing our speakers today, but unfortunately, Jessica Troel is unwell and Nathalie Segan had an emergency that she needed to attend to, so they won't be able to join. But we wish them speedy recovery and hope that everything is all right. But I'm still very, very lucky to have Lila Mehta. Professor Lila Mehta is professorial fellow at IBS. Her work focuses on water and sanitation, forced displacement and resistance, climate change, scarcity, rights and access, resource grabbing, and the politics of environment, development, and sustainability. Her recent project focuses on climate change, uncertainty, and transformation in marginal environments on and off-grid in urban areas. She has extensive field research in India, studying the politics of water scarcity, the linkages between gender, displacement, and resistance, access to water and sanitation in peri-urban areas, and climate change. Online, we have Catarina Fonseca. Catarina is trained as an economist and has a doctoral degree in water sciences. She has over 23 years of experience in the development cooperation and nonprofits, of which 20 in the water and sanitation sector. She has pioneered sector development on the understanding of life cycle costs on financing. She was the WASH cost director between 2008 and 2013, a large-scale initiative to identify the long-term costs of sustaining rural and peri-urban water and sanitation services. She has been part of the IRC management team and managed the International Innovation Program from 2012 to 2019. She was also the director of Watershed, a 5-year strategic program that ran from 2016 to 2020 to strengthen the availability of citizens to hold account governments and service providers for the services that they deliver. She is an associate of IRC and is available for consulting assignments. Over the past 20 years, she has trained, assessed, evaluated, and provided technical support to over 50 clients. And since 2019, she has her own company, Pulsing Tide. And then we have our third speaker in person, Alan Nicol. Alan leads the International Water Management Institute's strategic program on water growth and inclusion. This program comprises 3 research groups: circular economy and water pollution, economics and impact assessment, and governance and inclusion. In total, these teams comprise more than 40 researchers dispersed across some 10 countries in Asia and Africa. And this work includes to ensure gender equality at all levels, addressing policy issues on climate, water, and development in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, in a range of wicked problem areas for the complexity of domestic supply at households in rapidly transforming economies, the big picture challenges at basin scale in South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. We also have online our King's Water Centre research assistant, Tamara, and she'll help us with the Q&A. If you have any technical issues, just drop her an email and she will hopefully be able to help you out. And just off the screen, you can't really see, we also have another King's Water Centre research assistant, JC, who is helping do some technical work as well. So thank you so much for both of you. I think I've spoken enough. So we shall get straight on with our discussion. So I will ask Lila to kick us off. Over to you.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Naho, and it's a pleasure to be here to carry on the discussions. I'm going to stick to the brief you gave me, which was to just give you a little outline about being there in person, reflections of that, what was missing, around the narratives. And then I think hopefully collectively we can also talk about ways forward. But I mean, you've asked me to set the scene, which is what I'm going to do. So despite all my criticisms that will follow, I want to start by saying that I really was happy to be there and I enjoyed going there in person, despite the criticism. So I was grateful to be, it was historic, right? So after 46 years, we were there at this UN conference and God knows when there'll be another one. So in that sense, I was happy to be there. And, you know, compared to a lot of the meetings we usually go to, which is in Stockholm World Water Week or World Water Fora, which are run by sort of supranational NGOs, national NGOs, French, Swedish. I think it was great. There was a good buzz. Of course, there was issues of representation. A lot of people from the global south couldn't come. There were visa issues, but it was still lively, diverse, etc. So I think that was good. And it was really good to get this global buzz around water and sanitation, really in the media, even if it was for a week or 10 days only. So I think in that sense, it was great. Now, of course, there were huge expectations on this event. And I think it'd be nice to know more about the genesis of the event. Clearly, you know, we know the challenges, we know the off-track SDGs, the climate disruption that is affecting water access, the extreme events, the gross inequality, etc. And also the huge global collective failure that we've had for the last decades of planned development around water and, you know, violations of human rights on a daily basis by global state actors and violations, especially of marginalized people excluded due to gender, race, caste, ethnicity. But there was this buzz. We had about 7,000 people there from all walks of life, NGO, academia, the private sector, and there were lots and lots of different events at any point in time. But I think The buzz for me was more in the side events where there was lots of creativity, where interesting things were advanced, things that were missing from the official plenary. So, for example, feminist water agendas by Imi and others. The idea to join up. I mean, this whole idea of fragmented governance and how to join them up. A lot of these issues were addressed in the side events. For example, despite so many global reports around water, food, livelihoods, we still have this selective failure. So how do we link that up? Issues around sanitation, etc. But in terms of overall water governance, I think many questions remain. As we acknowledged before the event, water lacks a home in the UN, and that was kind of evident in the event too. Because you have the UNICEF, UNDP, they have their mandates, they look at water, but UN water doesn't really command, much. It's not a big player globally. So there was no direct call for a new architecture or a big engagement. There was a call for a water envoy, but we're still waiting to know who this envoy will be. And it could just be a political appointment. And if it is a political appointment or something that you're going to tick a box of, maybe a global South woman, I think that's what people are saying. But who will that be? And what's the mandate? Now, the meeting was hosted by two countries, the Dutch and Tajikistan. Massive, huge effort. But, two countries is not the same as a global agency doing it. And there's quite a lot around the Dutch and what they achieved, how they punched above their weight. The king was there. The presence of the Dutch was there massively everywhere. But in some ways, the dynamism of Henk Ovink, the special envoy on water, his missionary zeal, how he made it happen. I mean, there's quite a lot to analyze by Mohsin and others but we can't have a one country, one man show. We need much more than that. And, why is it that we don't have regular water meetings? Why is there no convention? Why is there no equivalent of the COP or the World Committee for Food Security in the water domain? So we don't have any binding agreements or convention. Not that makes, on the ground, it may not change much, but at least to have that official recognition is really important. And this was acknowledged by a open letter by more than 100 representatives from civil society, led by Water Witness, highlighting, the risks of climate-induced disruption, the massive problems around human rights, and the fact that we're just losing the plot and we've missed the game in some ways. Now, the meeting had a lot of voluntary pledges, 719 of them. So anybody could put up their pledge. But without proper financing, without accountability, without a plan, what's really going to happen? And indeed, there has been some analysis of these pledges. And I think only a quarter of them are potential game changers. But again, who's to hold this to account if they're violated or if they're not really, seen through? So I think in that sense, we're talking about a lack of proper finance, quantifiable targets, action, etc. Now, of course, water's everybody's business, and it's great. There was a huge presence of the World Economic Forum, Coca-Cola, the big private sector agencies, and we just have to wonder whether these agencies are the best equipped to actually deliver water to the poorest of the poor, especially in areas that are inaccessible, that need proper public finance. And, given the huge lapses of the private sector in realizing water security and actually increasing water insecurity and vulnerability. Now, when we talk about fragmentation, I think it was very, very strong, and it was still there. We have to talk about water, sanitation, and waste together, but mostly the emphasis tended to be on water. And then sanitation. There were great sessions on sanitation, but it was still largely about water. And we really need to bring them together. As I also said, despite so many landmark reports highlighting linkages, we were missing the plot in terms of highlighting linkages between water, climate, food, livelihoods, etc. And even around human rights, the need to link human rights. You can't just have human rights in an isolation, especially the human right around water is very narrowly defined. It's mostly around domestic. It doesn't really bridge domestic and productive use. Now, the conference saw the launch of many big reports. The most famous one of them was Turning the Tide from the Global Commission on Economics. It got a lot of attention. It was a lot about the global water cycle as a global common good, etc. But those of us working in water know that actually water is mostly at the local and regional level. Water is an imperfect public good. It's largely local and regional. And of course, we need water governance across scales. But I mean, it is kind of tricky to look at how you can actually manage the hydrological cycle, things like watersheds. And there's been interesting critiques of this in Water Alternatives. And also, do we need more economists working on water? Shouldn't we be talking about co-production between economists, hydrologists, sociologists, anthropologists, climate scientists, agronomists, etc.? And the four pillars you talk about, a lot of us have been working on these to discuss the framings. Do we need these apocalyptic framings around water shortage? Yes, that grabs the media attention, but it doesn't stay for very long. Water's out of the news now. When we talk about apocalypse, etc., this can divert attention from the thornier issues of power, politics, lack of accountability, transparency, public finance, fragmentation, etc. So I think, it was all great, but I want to know what's happening now. And I think we're still trying to figure out what's happening to the pledge, what is the UN doing, what's happened to this envoy. Are we going to have more meetings? Not that all this helps or works, but something. It's something better than waiting another 46 years. And also, I think it's about taking seriously the slow and structural violence around water and sanitation injustices that billions of people face every single day. And we've naturalized that. We've normalized that. We've naturalized women and, the struggles around actually just having a little pot of water and just having somewhere safe to shit, basically. And of course, we've naturalized the fact that there's disruption and it affects the poorest and climate change challenges. So unless we look at all this seriously, nothing is going to change. So I think we can't wait another 46 years. Maybe we will, but unless, some of these very basic things are addressed, I think we're going to be saying the same thing in 50 years' time.
Okay, thank you very much for that opening statement. Now we'll move on to Catarina, who is online.
All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for the invite to be here with you. And I was asked to talk about what has been missing from the picture on financing water, what was interesting to discuss at UN water meeting. And for that, I will use an example from the high-level panel on water investments for Africa, which is an initiative which also turned in a commitment or a pledge from the African Union to mobilize $30 billion a year for the subcontinent. And I think this was probably the largest pledge done at the UN water meeting. I have been advising this initiative as an advisor to the Dutch government, who's also supporting the high-level panel. So I only have 5 minutes. I'm going to show you a summary of the work because I'm an economist in the shape of a pyramid. And there's also a full report. I just want to highlight some of the discussions, what is different in the finance discussion, what has been missing. And there's a full report on the IP, the high-level panel website. You can find it very, very quickly. And I can also put it in the chat afterwards. So what is this triangle? What is it summarizing? The first step was really to find out, and I'm just going to focus on the African subcontinent because this is what the work, the focus of the work. But I think it's quite a good example that can be translated to other regions. So the first step was to find out if there is money, and this is on the left of the pyramid. And the second step was to find how much of that money could actually be mobilized for the water sector, which is, you can see it on the right of the pyramid. So I start at the bottom. And we have this big block called sector governance, efficiency gains, and cost savings. And this is well known. This is part of the narrative all along on financing the sector. So this is the amount of money that can be saved by reducing non-revenue water, which is still ridiculously high in many countries, as high as 60%. Why would you put money into a pipe that is leaking 60%? You lose 60% of the money. Increasing energy efficiency, having asset managements in place, having adequate tariff systems. And I think the important message from this work is that fixing this block, this bottom of the pyramid, is absolutely a necessary condition to unlock the rest of the pyramid. You cannot access the remaining funds if this is not fixed. And well, we could not find a way to represent that graphically, but that's the most important message. And immediately after, and now I start getting into the points on our discussion on finance that has been overlooked is that we have a block which is about valuing water-related risks and observing environmental standards. And this is about industries internalizing the cost of water abstraction and discharge, also treatment, and they need to internalize this cost instead of passing them to water utilities, which is happening in this moment in time. And it was interesting because this is also very much in line with some of the recommendations from the Global Commission on the Economics of Water. And I'm just going to give you an example because it was quite difficult to find hard data on this. And we found, because there's a fantastic organization called CDP, where industries, companies report their water risks and their investments. And the risks are also translated into financial losses. So the water, I'm going to just give you a data point here, or a couple of them, but the water risks reported to the CDP in 2022, which they only captured, because it's voluntary, 99 companies in Africa, have a potential impact in the water sector of $61 to $67 billion. And this represents industries from food, beverage, mostly, and agriculture, but also materials and manufacturing. And what was interesting was to look at these reports and see how these companies are responding to risk. And the primary responses include, let me just read, adoption of water efficiency, development of drought and flood emergency plans, securing alternative water supplies, promoting adoption of sustainable irrigation practices, improving alignment with water stewardship commitments. So it's all around this. So we know that this is bringing, internalizing some of this cost would save to the water sector quite a few billion. But this was the one data that we could not even have an estimate for the right side of the pyramid. But we're talking, so there's the efficiency block, which is quite large. And then there's this block on valuing water, which is the other source of additional funds. And after this, and I won't go now here into detail, but we have a whole block on domestic resource mobilization. Here, some of the new areas are institutional investors, but also more interesting, the enforcement of pollution and mineral resource taxes. Some countries, for instance, like Ethiopia, have these, but are not enforcing them. And we kind of really liked the idea of having a 1% tax from the mineral resources, and just a 1% tax on revenues would result in additional $4 billion for the water sector. And of course, then above that, we have then the more traditional treaties, the taxes, the tariffs, the transfers. But as you can see, this is really a narrow top of the pyramid. So the implications for the discussions on finance is really that we need to go way beyond these traditional T's in the water sector that get us stuck with the tariffs and the taxes and the transfers, which are very small. And given this much broader cross-sectoral nature of many of the resources we need to mobilize, it does require conversations at the level of heads of state, basically. Which is what the African Union is the coalition of heads of state. And so it's really interesting to have this discussion at that level. This was the work over a year involving, I don't know, more than 200 organizations. And there's a report, and now there's also, they're developing an investment plan for this and bringing task teams to work in a plan, basically how to get from the left of the pyramid to the right. But again, with this lower block being absolutely critical to unlock the remaining of the finance. So I'll stop here. I'm happy to answer questions and to talk about this later. Over to you, Naho. Thank you.
Thank you, Catarina, for that. We'll swiftly move on to Alan, and then that will be sort of the initial opening talks. We'll have some thoughts for you.
Yeah, thank you, Naho, and thank you, Lila and Catarina. That's super food for consumption and thinking through these enormous issues. I'm struck by a few things. So I'm commenting on the two presentations. I think that pyramid summarizes quite nicely, Catarina, the magnitude of the challenge, right? And the conference was very much focused on this global scale, as Lila mentions. And they talk about game changers. And I wanted to just relate to that pyramid a bit when they mention the game changers. And some of those game changers are about working in new ways and thinking laterally, instead of this kind of vertical thinking about how, multilateral national institutions work together, thinking about joining up the dots. So on your pyramid there, Catarina, I'm wondering on, say, for instance, non-revenue water. Often it's seen as a loss to the system and a loss to the entity or the provider. But it's someone else's gain, right? And that gain can be a social good that isn't part of the system, but is an informal access to the system. What I'm not trying to justify non-revenue water, but I'm trying to show how the complexities of that large base of the pyramid are rooted in issues of power and politics and essentially poverty in many countries. So it's a horizontally a requirement of horizontal thinking to try and unpick these challenges and to work out how to build on that huge potential there, but thinking about it, not so much just in the financial sense, but more in a social sense. And that was one of the messages that came out of the final statement from the UN Secretary General. I believe he even said we need to think about water as a social resource. So it's thinking differently. That was one of the outputs from the conference, which I think is very important. And I would also echo partly what Laila's saying about, the combining of economics and social science, systems thinking to really unpack some of these mega challenges that have been identified. The second big area, which I think, you touched on, Laila, and is implicit in your pyramid, Catarina, is this institutional governance challenge. There was, again, it wasn't an elephant in the room in New York. It was charging around the corridors, and it was a very loud four-legged beast that was screaming at everyone. How are we going to turn these voluntary commitments, even if it's the African Development Bank or whoever, how do we turn voluntary commitments into a process of effective delivery? And the sense was, who would be taking forward those commitments and tracking those commitments and monitoring those commitments? And as you'll know, Catarina, of course, from all your previous work, it's the devil in the detail of tracking and monitoring and managing who is doing what are the indicators of success, how are we going to follow up. If you look in detail at the 9 game changers that came out that are in the final report of the conference, they talk about the first follow-up intergovernmental event may be convened within 3 years, right? So, there's a qualifier in there. And a lot of the text from the UN conference involves umpteen qualifiers. So, when you say it may be convened within 3 years, what kind of mechanism is there going to be to ensure that these commitments are carried out? To actually say that of the, I think it's now 825 commitments, of which a quarter are from government, who is going to hold government to account? They do talk about a new political mechanism. So I would say, Laila, some of the questions you raised there about the politics of this have been semi-addressed in the game changers that were in the final outcome document of the conference. So there is this sense of a need for a new mechanism. An institutional architecture actually is what it talks about, number 8, I think, of the game changers. And that includes reform of the UN agency responsible for water, the UN Water. So they are acknowledging some of the big institutional governance challenges at a global level, and the establishment of a board of UN agencies working on water. So that's great, right? These are very important institutional shifts, but who's going to govern that board? Who's going to check on progress if there isn't a sort of a metronome signal every 3 years where the General Assembly and others get together and review what's happened out of these 825 commitments, what has been delivered? So there are big challenges embedded in all of these issues, from a joining up of new thinking to institutional governance. I'd just like to say one last thing, and I think that's around this language of a common good. So the UN conference was replete with language of water as a common good. The global water system is a common good that needs to be treated as a common good, which is rival and non-excludable, right? A common good, not a public good, but a common good, which is, like fish in the ocean, right? Everyone's got access to them, but the more someone takes, the lesser for someone else. So the idea of a common good was part of the narrative and the language of the meeting. But what does that translate to when, for example, you're talking about big business and the delivery of these commitments? Who pays? Bottom line is, who pays for all of these changes? How do we factor in the need to cover the costs of these enormous structural changes to a global system that is under huge climate pressure? So who's going to pay? And I think the big elephant for me in the big conference was who's going to pay. Catarina, you provided some examples there of the kind of structured thinking that's necessary. But I still wonder who eventually will pick up the tab. Will it be taxpayers? Will it be the private sector investing in a good that is a common good? Or will they be pressured to privatize more of that good? Where are these pressures going to lead post-conference? So I think there are lots of questions that have been raised, and Lily, you've spoken to many of them. My sense is ultimately there was a missionary zeal in the conference, and a great deal of belief, as opposed to hard science and hard numbers. There was a real kind of strand of belief in it that somehow things will turn around and there will be a change, a game-changing environment, but no real systemic structural evidence that has taken place yet, which I think, considering the last conference was 46 years ago, is a worry. So those are my thoughts.
Great stuff. Do Laila and Catarina, do you want to make some initial reactions, initial thoughts based on what you've heard from each other?
Just Catarina.
Yeah, Catarina, you've unmuted yourself, so go ahead.
Well, I'm not going to answer all of Alan's questions, but just some pointers and maybe to add to the discussion. I mean, not only the bottom of the pyramid is political and powers. The whole pyramid is political and powers. Everything that has to do with money is politics and powers, and the whole UN water is politics and powers. I mean, I think we all need to acknowledge that. Who's going to take this forward? Well, I mean, and yes, I thought a fantastic report because it does bring some new ideas of the Global Commission on Water. And yes, it's a global report with additional data and very scary data, actually. But ultimately, it's heads of state. Heads of state are the ones responsible to bring some of this discussion, especially when water or the lack of it, so water scarcity starts affecting food security, starts impacting migrations, displacement, the world economy, you name it. I mean, it's a whole domino effect, right? But here's the interesting thing that I noticed at UN Water meeting. For the first time, I've seen the industries and companies taking action and reacting way before governments. We're talking about, because of course, if they don't have water, it will impact very fast on their own businesses. So I did miss the heads of state and their commitments at UN Water meeting, while I was seeing companies that I never expected to be talking about water stewardship and taking more responsibility, because it will affect their business. I'm aware that I'm not, naive thinking, oh, we're all here for human rights or whatever. But it was very clear. It was very clear to see businesses and companies engaging more with the water as a common good than governments. And I'm speaking to you from Portugal. At the moment, there's already, last year, the whole Portugal and Spain, there's a whole water stress, water crisis. It's, again, the same thing this year. It's going to get worse. And pretty much anyone can use the water here for anything. Agriculture, there's absolutely no accountability on the uses of water. There's no discussions on it. And yes, this is very scary. So who follows up? They have governments. It has to be governments, and it's citizens that hold their governments accountable. And some of these conversations, I do think they need this more dramatic version because or data because it is very critical. And yeah, well, anyway, I have a lot more to talk about this and strong opinions, but I'll open it to the audience.
Great stuff. Laila, you want to add to that?
Yeah, so well, thank you so much, Catarina and Alan, and I also look forward to hearing from the audience. So firstly, in terms of, it's interesting that the pyramid was one of the, the strongest commitments. And I think, yes, it's great to have that level of finance, but I think I was slightly missing, it was great to break things down and look at things in different ways. But, one could also question, what is efficiency? Who defines it? Efficiency for whom? How does one, the whole thing about the multiple values of water. And I think in these high level panels on finance, you have a particular take, not, on what is value and what counts. And again, that brings it around the sort of economics of water. So I wanted to raise that one point. The second is, yes, they have these 9 game changers of the event, and they say they'll do this and that, but it's very fuzzy. And there's some meeting in Tajikistan, and even maybe earlier, but I'm not really convinced. And it'll be great to, I think we just have to watch this space. But when you look at the difference between water and what's going on in the food sector or in the climate domain, in the food domain, there's a huge difference. And also, I think in terms of activism, I think, climate activists, food movements have been far more successful actually in mobilizing. There was this anti-dam movement, but, around some of these other issues that we've been talking about today, we haven't really seen that. Now, in terms of, a public good is rivalrous and non-excludable. And I'm not convinced that works at the global level for water. Because, how do you look at things like evaporation and clouds? And so, it sounds nice, but I think, I think we have to work at that global level, looking at it as a public and the public nature of it. But it's very, very tricky given the slippery nature of water, the whole liquid dynamics around it. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges that we have. Because it's so slippery and dynamic and variable, we tend to take it for granted. Who should take this for? So companies, I have 2 more points. Companies, yes, the companies started getting interested in water from the World Economic Forum in 2011, I think. And there was this whole thing around water security. And as you say, Catarina, whose security are they interested in? And it was all about these global risks. And it was around the time of the water grabbing and the land grabbing, the big land deals that were happening. And you also then had the companies getting interested. But don't forget that in 2000, the big companies were the ones that were vehemently against the human right to water. If you look at the resistance from Nestle and others. But of course, now Nestle and Coca-Cola are all into the human right to water. But what does that really mean? And I think with governments, I think the only way to do it would be, we have to name and shame. It's not just governments. Name and shame the companies, name and shame the governments, name and shame the global UN agencies. And I think we have to be talking about, how do we mobilize around really seeing water and sanitation as social goods? And the whole issue of public finance. And, it's not like there isn't money, whose priorities count. If you look at the amount of money that is being spent on the military or on other things, how do we create a movement to really push for this kind of financing? And money is not everything, because ultimately you could throw money and it could also be lost. So, I guess it's a combination of, the public emergency around water linked to climate and sanitation, etc., around with, accountability, monitoring, etc.
Okay, sounds good. I've written quite a few notes, and I have a lot of questions. And one of the pressing ones I have is the role of the state. But before we get into that, perhaps just to keep it a little bit more interactive, we'll start opening the floor. So the floor is open to both the online audience as well as the in-person audience. There's already a hand in the in-person audience. So while we get ready, for those of you online, please start posting your thoughts, comments on the Q&A, and we'll start picking them up. If you're on a mobile phone or using a web browser, there might not be the Q&A button. If that doesn't show up, fret not, you can just raise your hand, and people have already started raising their hand. So we'll go in turns. We'll take the in-person audience question first. So go ahead.
Hi, thanks, Naho. So I'm Scott McCready. I'm Chief Strategy Officer for a thing called the Alliance for Water Stewardship. So we are an alliance of kind of transnational corporations, international NGOs, research agencies, MEs a member, etc., etc. We're part of the water stewardship community. We are focused on private sector water users engaging in kind of improving kind of water sustainability. Catarina talked about CDP, so we're part of a community of organisations. So there's AWS, CDP, Seal Water Mandate, GNZ, WWF, WRI, etc., etc. I think it was really interesting when Catarina was saying this. I think one of the reasons I came here was about the word dissonance. So the thing they really noticed was there was lots of activity in the private sector, and there has been, but it really felt it was a coming of age moment for the kind of the private sector, etc., etc. But if you think about what the private sector are doing, they're responding to risk, and they're responding to failures of governance, and responding to failures of IWRM, etc., etc. So it's a water user-centric response to kind of why kind of water has not been managed properly. Now there's dangers in that. So obviously, from our perspective, we're a standard system, so we're designed to kind of like ensure that there's no issues of policy capture, resource capture, etc., by big companies, etc. I think the thing that I'm kind of like sort of was struck by at UN Water was Catarina was saying that sort of like governments aren't engaging with this, so they're not engaging with kind of with the opportunity of kind of major water users, but they're also not engaging with the threat of major water users. So kind of like there is no kind of connection, and I think it's from our perspective, we've done a lot of research in terms of how water stewardship is connected with national policy and national regulators and so on and so forth. And there's just not that many good examples. And I'm not really sure how we bridge that, because sort of like we put out a joint statement to governments, etc., to get people on board. But who do we actually engage with? This sort of like, I mean, from our perspective, we're looking to focus on particular locations to evidence the value of collective action and companies going beyond their fence line and so on and so forth. But it still does feel like there's a huge disconnect between kind of like the water policy conversation over here and the water users conversation over here.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Did the panel want to react initially?
Just one observation. I mean, I don't know. I felt that the part of the statement by the UN Secretary General was about this conjoining of climate and water policy, right? Which sounds intuitively a great thing to do, right? Because those two things are kind of bedfellows. They exist together. And they but one of the narratives, and Lila will like this, but one of the narratives that's risky in that is that it's naturalizing all the problems in the water world, right? It's climate change, climate extremes, drought, floods. It's climate change, which, you know, kind of absolves government to an extent of responsibility for poor planning, for locating industries in floodplains and other areas like that, or encouraging industry into areas where it's more at risk, or people indeed, you know, building houses in certain areas, or just simply not thinking about how things connect up and thinking systemically. So I think there's an issue there about the narratives that are involved in some of these global debates. I don't quite agree with Lila that it shouldn't be a big global crisis kind of debate. I think it is important to make to sort of rattle that whatever alarm bell, and if you rattle a bell, but you know, to show that it's a global crisis is important to gain attention. But it really is about national level governments engaging more. I agree. And engaging as parties who are responsible for some of the challenges and overcoming them and providing solutions or supporting, you know, collective action solutions. So avoiding too much of the naturalized climate change rhetoric, but acknowledging the connections is very important.
I know you want to say
I mean, let me clarify. I think it is a huge crisis, okay? But I mean, how is the crisis defined? So Don't get me wrong. Of course, there's a crisis, but I'm interested in the users, in people who are affected. So in that sense, not this kind of thing about we're running out of water. I mean, for me, the crisis is the lack of access, or the fact that we have a governance crisis. We have there's plenty of water at one level, but the mismanagement, and it's then very easy to scapegoat nature or whatever. So I think that's where I'm coming from. And I mean, I guess, there are users and users. So there will be big users, and the government is going to be very cozy with them, right? And big companies and others. But it's the small users, it's the invisible users, it's users who have no rights. I mean, I think that, again, is a complicated thing. And especially when you're talking about customary systems, informal rights, and, how do you capture all that also and look at those kind of users? And then when you formalize these user groups or situations, often you can also have elite capture. So I guess these are also some of the governance challenges that we need to contend with.
And there is a great history where states have actively built structures to exclude certain users, to exclude certain user groups, and not necessarily just through water, but through notions of citizenship, through land tenure, etc.
Absolutely.
So here, this is where a lot of the intersection emerges. I think, Catarina, you wanted to react?
Yes, I wanted to just bring just a very concrete examples of also what this idea of water as a global common good looks like, and to give it a little bit more of a very practical visualization. So I think the most interesting data from the Commission was around the hydrological cycles, which, again, there's science pro and there's science against. So this is not yet fully proven, but there are measures which are being proven, which is you can track rainfall, and you can track rainfall connected with specific environmental man-made actions. So, for instance, the best example, and the ones that they were able to prove, and you can find it also articles in just normal newspapers, is that, for instance, cutting trees in the cutting of the trees in Brazil, in the Amazon, has impacted soy production in Argentina. And the Global Commission has also put the hotspots, so the big hotspots of where you're going to find more water scarcity and how they impact the hydrological cycle flows and impacts basically food production in other countries. And I think the message is, yes, this affects us all. It's not just it affects citizens, it affects the economy, it affects productivity of companies. And I think the more interesting thing that I've seen, which is not dependent on values of any other stakeholder group, is for industries to trying to be water positive. So basically, you put more than what you take in whatever measurements, but you deliver more water to the world than the one that you take. And this is independent from values. This is just like data, you're just putting more than you take out. And this is very difficult for some countries, especially in the Middle East, where there's, you even have to take more water from. I met someone in the plane sitting next to me that was basically shipping water from Greenland to the Middle East. This is real. And I spent 5 hours talking with this gentleman because I was just interested, and it was a great business model. Anyway, not sure it's great for the planet. But so I think, I think it's important to take some, even if we can't grasp it completely, especially when there are sentences that say that we have reached the boundaries. There's also a Netflix series on it. We reached the water planetary boundary. That part I'm like, okay, I don't understand how water can be a boundary, how you can go over it. But water as a global common good is very understandable, especially if you start looking at regional data and you look at waterfall, rainfall data. So I just wanted to bring that over to make it more clear for the people online what we are talking about.
Okay.
Hope it helps.
Thank you very much. We have a hand on the online audience.
All right. My name is Canan Roy, and I was in the Oxford Water Science Policy and Management graduate program. And most of the panel, the work that they've done were either a part of selections or part of the course readings, or I came across in my wider reading. So it was a great opportunity to hear you guys speak from KCL. So I think it's a slightly compound question, actually 3 parts, but one thing which is beyond the scope of maybe this discussion, is optional whether the panel would like to take this on, is something that bothered me during my course was this graph of economic growth versus investments in hydrologic infrastructure, and essentially showing a positive correlation. And I just couldn't figure out how to challenge it, but it just seemed like it was something which polemically, I mean, you can see why the political messaging is strong around it, but I just felt like my initial reaction was, well, if you straighten all the channels, you dam all the rivers, then yeah, you reduce variability, and then you also happen to become a richer country, not causation, correlation. So I was a little, I know there are multiple economists on the panel, so I was curious whether this is something that, I mean, how you'd react to this, whether you have an kind of a more informed opinion than I do. The other two are simpler. On the UN water, I've just been looking at a lot of TORs and trying to understand a little bit about how does one work with the UN or in the UN, and I just find that it's intensely bureaucratic and very difficult to understand the structure. And it makes me wonder about John Briscoe's quote, which I can't say verbatim, but like 13 years ago, I mean, when he was asked about policy, he said, we really need to, water people think too much about water. And essentially what he was saying was that no country's brought anyone out of poverty without looking at infrastructure, energy, and transportation. So water can only be one of many things. So I'm just wondering whether having, it's a bit of a contrarian stance, but having, a dedicated UN thing to water beyond what it already is might actually not do as much as one hopes, because the more I got into my program and I came out of it, is bizarre, but I had the same feeling that, everything is not about water, strangely, after getting more and more specialized into it. And the more I looked at utilities, I was like, it's more important to understand other energy utilities, and there's so many parallels and so many contrasts with water, and you need to understand infrastructure as a whole. So yeah, I mean, that little problem with everything not being about water. And the thing that Dr. Mehta mentioned about the water alternatives critique, it would be nice to know who the authors were, because that's been a problem, that you have a lot of global scale work using satellite imagery or planetary models, some of the stuff we study in the program, and then you have a lot of people working at the catchment scale on more micro level, and it's like global water budgets, local water budgets, linking. If there's any more work on that and you could point to that, that would be really nice. Thank you. Sorry, it was a really long, compound set of questions. Thanks.
Right. Would anybody like to take a stab? I mean, first of all, Cyan, I'm going to recommend you to watch this big movie called Everything Everywhere All at Once. That might give you a start on how everything is connected. But on a more serious note,
well, I'll take a stab, but I don't think I have an answer to your first question, Cyan, although it's a good one. So you see a graph that's been repeatedly used of, I think it's cereal output in Ethiopia and rainfall, right? A famous one. Catarina, David Gray loves that one. So you'll find it in many of the articles that are produced on water and growth. And it shows this beautiful congruence between rainfall and GDP going up and down, up and down, up and down. As if it's the only factor in affecting, rain-fed agriculture in Ethiopia. But it's used in the context, for instance, of the 2006 Ethiopia World Bank country strategy on water investment, right? And it's used in the same sense that the term hostage to hydrology is used, yeah? So the idea is the the subtext is that controlling the resource, reducing these fluctuations, will somehow translate into economic growth. So it's a very simplistic argument. There are elements of it that may be right. Yeah, there is a certain minimal level of infrastructure, and right at the moment, IMI and GWP and the bank and others are looking at the need for storage, strategic storage, in relation to climate extremes, for example, as a key investment area. But what kind of storage is that? Grey infrastructure, green infrastructure? Is it going to be large scale, small scale? All sorts of questions surrounding that. So probably it's wise to say there isn't a direct correlation, but there are important relationships between a water system, both natural and man-made, in a country, and economic growth. Although now even the term economic growth itself is difficult to use and shouldn't be used. In fact, even the World Bank is rolling back on the use of the term GDP per capita, et cetera, et cetera. So, the whole, if you like, the paradigm is changing. So I think there's a big paradigm shift out there. And if I were in your stage of the career that you're in, I'd be looking at low growth and no growth models and water resource management strategies. So, I think the answer is there's no direct correlation, but it's being used in many senses to justify certain types of investments over the last 20 years. But that paradigm is changing. That's my answer. Not really an answer, comment.
Just very quickly, I think, yes, this whole idea of infrastructure, fine, but now we know that when this command and control and controlling the resource also leads to all kinds of ripple down effects, right? So you can't predict things, and with climate change, you have to embrace uncertainty too. So I think in some ways, there's all kinds of questions about this infrastructure too, and whether it can withstand shocks and stresses. And, we are talking about post-growth, degrowth, also, decarbonization, etc. The UN is very yes, every UN agency is very, very bureaucratic. We know that. But the question is, do we want one that is actually championing the cause, or we want something like UNFCCC for water, or are we happy with UN Water, which, is very invisible, doesn't have much visibility, etc. And look at the blog post, the recent Dissensus Forum and Water Alternatives, the last 2 months. So the two of us wrote one, and Chris Perry wrote one critiquing the report. And actually, he took a slightly different position to you, Catarina. And, it does sound like a lot of scientists are questioning, while some scientists say, yes, rainfall, something cutting the tree somewhere will affect something elsewhere, simply because of the uncertainty around science and even the uncertainty around determining these boundaries, etc., and the hydrological cycle. Some people question those basic assumptions in that report.
All right, we have in-person question, so we'll take that question, and then I know there is a hand up on the online, so we'll take that question as well. So yes, that's the hand I'm talking about. So first of all,
thank you. That's
36 also.
Thank you. That's always never end an interesting discussion on. My name is Mohsen from Water Security and Sustainability at the University. And just to follow the discussion and just trying to organize what I'm thinking, very, very carefully and thoughtfully mentioned 2-3 terms, especially of my attention, the game. And I'm just wondering if we want to change the game. Do we know, or do we have enough knowledge about this game in water, and especially that we know, this game, is restricted in a bigger politically from geopolitical competition and economy. The bigger capitalist version. So as academics, I'm just thinking, if you want to change this game, do we have enough knowledge? And if we have we done enough, to impact this game? And I'm just trying to articulate this question with respect to two first planks in your book, and which very carefully and thoughtfully chosen, and make a link to the division between global north, which is the producer of those knowledge, or sometimes manipulated those knowledge, to the global south, which is usually saying the scarcity is met. And with the increased engagement, as mentioned, the private company as well, I'm just thinking how, or just thinking, if we want to change this game, we need, at least as academics, just to much more critically and even radically challenge those knowledge in a bigger game. Yeah. And that would be interesting to hear your ideas as well. Yeah.
Good point. So the first part was what is the game? What is the game we're playing? If we're going to be game changing, where are the boundaries of the game? And the second part is how does knowledge come into play? Whose knowledge matters if the global norms are set by global so-called global north players that have been very obvious. And as Lila said, there were issues of representation. Would anybody like to take that first?
What is the game?
Yeah.
I mean, I would see the game as the failure to achieve the SDG 6 targets to a large extent in large chunks of the world. So the game is one of, I hate to say it, I don't want to sound negative here, but there has been quite massive collective failure. So the game that needs to be changed is why that's happened, and and who's involved in that collective failure, who hasn't pulled their weight, who hasn't invested. I think that there's a sense that the current system, maybe it's the states involved, maybe it's the level of commitment to various mechanisms. SWA, for instance, Catarina, has done some great work, right? But is that sufficient? It's necessary, but not sufficient to kind of fill the gap that's required globally to meet the SDG target. So, the game is one of identifying and addressing those factors that have led to some of the failures, and to thinking differently, to borrow a phrase, think differently about what we need to do next, because the coming 10 years, I like to repeat this, in the last 30 years, the last 46 years, atmospheric carbon has increased by 30%, since the last UN conference. It's gone up by an order of magnitude never seen before on this planet. So, never seen for 400,000 years, roughly. So we're in a new game that's also an enormous wrench and change in the global hydrological system, caused by the global warming, caused by that carbon concentration. So, the new game is going to be a lot harder to play than the old game. We didn't even manage to play the old game very well. So I think, that's why I don't want to be too gloomy, but it's a very serious period we're in, and the UN conference output doesn't quite match that level of seriousness, I think. Personal views.
And I think for some, the game, there almost is no game. This game is, again, one of a global north imagination, where if you are a person living in an informal settlement, trying to get water, trying to keep clean, trying to keep your kids alive, then, this whole notion of a game changer somewhere out in New York is probably very unrealistic, very bizarre, very detached. And so again, there are these multiple layers in which there are discourses that are focusing around about who's going to win this game, who's going to accelerate, whose progress is this going to be, and at the very sort of grounded level, people's lived experiences are certainly not matching up to this talk. I would argue. There's been a very patient person. I know Nick has been raising, and so we'll give the floor to Nick, and Tamara is going to unmute.
We also have a couple of questions on chat and Q&A.
Yes, so we'll take Nick's question first, and then we'll go on to the Q&A. Go for it, Nick.
Yeah, and apologies for not being able to join the beginning of the meeting. I was really hoping to hear the full session. I'll catch them on the recording. So apologies for that. And you may have answered this question already, but my question is about whether there's an opportunity for us to, as a collective of progressive researchers, activists, practitioners, to cut through the dissonance with a alternative perspectives about what needs to happen to address the water crisis. Because, and just to recap what happened since the brilliant meeting you held in, was it February, before the UN meeting?
March.
Sorry?
Yeah, it was in March, like 2 weeks
In
before.
March.
Yeah.
Inspired by that meeting, we started to discuss amongst ourselves whether, you know, given that the UN Water Conference wasn't going to cut it, what could we as a collective propose as an alternative? And during the event, it became really clear that I struggled to find anybody who was happy with the process or the likely outcomes. Everybody in New York was grumbling. Everybody not in New York was grumbling about it. But we didn't see a very clear articulation of that. And so a bunch of us, including many of you, and thanks for that, we scrambled to put together an open letter of concern that we fired off to the Secretary General and the co-conveners, the President of Tajikistan and the King of the Netherlands. And we set out the grumbles in 3 sections. First of all, we said, look, 700 voluntary commitments to tackle the global water crisis, which is already a hugely fragmented sector, it isn't going to cut it. We need binding commitments that hold people to account. So accountability. The second one was rigor. You know, where are the mountains of systematic reviews to see what was working and what wasn't working in the water sector that could inform the future? Where was the proper engagement with stakeholders out there to get their views on what was going wrong, what should be happening? If any of you were involved in some of the preparatory meetings for the event, they were a shambles. It was who could shout loudest and who knew the organizers who could get a space on the floor. So it was a real shambles. So the second point was rigor. And the third point was ambition. And this is where some of the dissonance crept in. You know, from Water Witness, we've been pushing for a new UN convention on equitable use of water in the economy. The reason being that if you want to reference pollution control in a trade agreement, you need a transnational treaty or mechanism to point to, so that you can embed it in a trading agreement. So there's a sort of structural need for that kind of thing. So we pushed for ambition through some sort of new transnational water governance regime, which meant that countries in the global north can't meet their food security needs by exploiting water resources in the global south, for example. So there's some new mechanisms to make sure that global common is managed on an equitable basis. And so we fired this letter in, and we got some interesting responses. It was featured in The Guardian. Many of you signed it, and thanks for that. It was referenced by Henk, who thought it was great. He wanted more of this. It helps us push for better outcomes. It was also referenced in the speech of Lord Goldsmith. So it suddenly became UK policy, which somebody got in trouble for. But it basically, in his closing plenary speech, he said, you know, take heed of this open letter and follow up on its recommendations. And what we see is that gives us an opportunity to use that letter and the response as a platform for further engagement with the system to articulate and advocate for a better alternative. What if the UN Water Conference was, excuse my language, a bit shit? What should be happening instead? And how can we galvanize global efforts to tackle the water crisis? So that's my question. We're planning a meeting, it might have been mentioned already, we're planning a meeting in London, I think, in September, to bring together some of the protagonists and signatories to that letter to try and work this out. You know, if we're going to ask for a bunch of things, what should that bunch of things be, and where's the evidence? So I just wonder whether the panel think that it's possible to cut through the dissonance with a series of pithy asks to global decision makers and stakeholders, or is that a pipe dream?
Okay, so we have a tall order. How are we going to move forward? Well, what's going to be our ask now that we've critiqued? What's our ask to move forward?
You said it much more succinctly than I could now.
Any thoughts? Any initial reactions?
Very quickly, but I always jump in. It's about lobbying, Nick. I think that you say it's shit, but I think actually it was good because it revealed the need for something. Yeah, the UN conference revealed a gap. To me, it was a gap identifier in a sense, which was required after 46 years, and that gap is what has partially been filled by some of these game-changing commitments. Well, they're not even commitments, game changers they're called, that came out of the final statement. Including this UN board, this new UN board, including new capacity, an intergovernmental process, but nothing formalized, right? These are just kind of pretty vague ideas at this time, but they're on paper. So I would say use that letter and use the response to it from Lord Goldsmith and others to lobby for change. It's a lobbying job now. And I think it's building a coalition of the willing and able to lobby that's really critical. And that has to be a global coalition, not something from the global north. It's got to be really led by stakeholders around the world. So I think it's important. Yeah. And I think in that sense, this is a juncture we're at now, which is quite significant. I don't know if you've seen the Guardian headlines today about the COP28 conference, but in terms of global governance issues of these big events, there are major challenges right now, and the water sector would do well to show the way, to show some kind of leadership here in how things should be done, and not continually say, let's try and do a UNFCCC. Let's do something different, but let's make it original.
Carla, you wanted to?
Yeah, well, firstly, Nick, it's nice that we're carrying on this, this momentum after the meeting before the conference and look forward to September, and that great that you did that letter. I don't think the conference was entirely shit. I think it was great to get everybody together. I mean, of course, it highlighted the gaps and it did create some kind of momentum. For me, the challenge is, okay, what happens now? So, we were all waiting for something. What happens now? And I think you're good to highlight what kind of action. I think water can learn from other sectors like food and climate. I mean, whether we want to have, something like the World Committee on Food Security is a really interesting entity, which is a multi-stakeholder dialogue. Every year you have people coming from everywhere, from the movements, from companies. And I think that's an interesting model. Maybe we can also try and learn from the climate experiences. It's just more momentum in water, food, and even health. And I think, we can learn from them. And how do we push for accountability? How do we demand it? I think, Nick, you guys work on this. Accountability, transparency, also in data, but also in terms of human rights violations. How do we make that happen? And I think that's something we have to collectively work on.
Catarina, you have your hand up.
I just wanted to add, and also answering part of the previous question from the room. I mean, that's the difference of the water sector with health, food, education. Yeah, it's that these sectors have harmonized approaches, funding, narratives. It's clear they have their own even funding mechanisms, and we in the water sector, especially at global but also at country level, is extremely fragmented. I mean, look at SDG 6. Just SDG 6, you have different agencies responsible for each of the sub-targets, and then some of them are supposed to measure some and others are, I mean, even the UN target. So I wonder, again, I put my my eggs in the heads of state, in governments, and not at UN level. Yes, it's nice. It's nice we all come together, but ultimately the decisions, the accountability at this point, and especially seeing that we have 7 years to go, it's at heads of state level. And indeed, SWA is doing a great work. It's not enough because, again, there's so much fragmentation. Yeah, so I think in terms of the game changer is just trying to have a little bit more harmonized discourse and narrative and direction and vision in the sector, which we have, but it's all in different parts. Over.
All right, so consolidating narratives been suggested. I just want to pick up the Q&A question. So from Natalie Richards, I think we have a question on the private sector. So what kind of reactions were they to who will pay, any trends or commitments? What sort of interactions were seen between the public and private sector regarding this shared responsibility? Catarina, do you want to comment on this, considering that you have some insight on this?
Sure. I mean, okay, so I'm not sure about the shared responsibility. Again, I recall, so the private sector, you really had a lot of examples on private sector talking about water stewardship, voluntary disclosures, different ways of investing themselves in the sector. You also had some more opportunistic approaches. So, for instance, there was Bayer was saying that they were developing a new rice grain that would consume 3 times or 4 times, I don't remember exactly the data, less water than a normal grain of rice and variety. So you also have like a whole private sector adapting to less water or more polluted water. In terms of the public sector, well, some of the discourses on financing was on increasing domestic resource mobilization, which is fantastic. So that is before, I mean, a couple of years ago, you just hear more ODA, more ODA. Well, there is no ODA, there's no aid. It's decreasing and it should be used in a catalytic way, and it's not there. So yes, it was really nice to see the public sector, the few colleagues that were there talking about the public finance, also from the South, talking about domestic resource mobilization. The share responsibility, I have not heard so much, no.
Yeah, I was part of a panel at the World Bank side events, Catarina, where it was a public finance panel. There was quite a strong narrative on the need for a stronger focus on public finance, public sector finance, partly in recognition of some of the earlier models, you know, that private finance, private utilities would step in and cover gaps, having failed. And you know, not completely, but in many parts of the world, particularly in Africa, not working as they were expected to work. So public finance seems to be coming back into fashion somewhat, but not just, you know, for those reasons, but also to do with the kind of moral leadership question. You know, if this is going to become a political issue, as you say, all of that pyramid is political, then the politics and the finance need to come together, and therefore public finance to some extent is going to be more important in the future. So I think, and that was a World Bank side panel, right? So it was a side event. So I was quite impressed, surprised, but happy to hear that.
Catarina, do you want to react?
Just to add, indeed, and the other discourse besides on the public finance or government budgets was also, and I also know that there was a meeting of the Water Finance Coalition. So this is the coalition of public development banks, national public development banks, and it's great to see them getting into the picture, because this is through public development banks is how we in the North, many of us, got water supply services and sanitation. So far, they have not been much part, or they didn't even have the mandate, some of them, to work in the water sector. We have great examples from Latin America now, and well, Europe, and also there's more and more African development banks than national development banks working or trying to work more in the water sector, which is also very different from previous years. So that's also promising. Over.
Just a few points. I mean, it's very good to have this debate on public finance. I think, you know, when you look at the global north, and several cities have actually re-municipalized and gone back to public hands. So I think, you know, it's a bit rich to say, you know, let's have the private sector take care of off-grid settings in wherever, Nairobi or Kathmandu. And also we're talking about very different challenges because these are off-grid places with informal settlements. And I think there you need, you really need a state to be committed. And it's questions of citizenship and citizenship rights, as Naho said. So really, it's a contract between citizens and the state. And often if we're talking about citizens that don't count, that are, you know, minorities or Black, you know, so-called migrants. I mean, it's about changing that narrative too, to take care of the most vulnerable, the poorest, etc. And, you know, I have two other points. One was, you know, it's great that Zach Goldsmith was so committed to the letter, but I think, Nick, you have to ask him why the UK cut 80 billion last year. Very shameful ODA cuts, you know, and the UK has been extremely shameful in terms of reneging. And, you know, when you think about the knock-on effect on water and sanitation, I think there was almost 80% of cuts to crucial services. So, you know, the UK has to also, and rich countries really have to be committed in terms of ODA commitments. And you can't just use Ukraine and the pandemic as an excuse. It's more ideological. And the last point I wanted to make was, you know, there are governments that are very dynamic. South Africa has been extremely dynamic in its commitment to human rights and water, and you still have so many failures there. So I guess the question is, despite, you know, strong policies, you still have, I mean, it's been great, the progress there, but still, in terms of account, how do we really, you know, actually realize these rights, these basic rights, despite them being enshrined constitutionally?
On that point of social contract, I just want to pick up one more question before we close. There's this question that was posted in the chat by Ayush Patel asking, in light of the inherent power dynamics, how are we going to think about inclusivity, equitable participation of those that are been marginalized, the indigenous communities, especially when there's been a lot of involvement of big companies? So would anybody like to take a stab about inclusion, equity? Are these just, once again, ideals and ideologies that are just being promoted, or are there really effective ways that we can really grapple with them?
Yeah. I mean, it's a good question, but essentially that's what our standard was designed to do. Is our standard was designed as a way for companies to act responsibly and be independently audited against what they have done. Now, why would they submit themselves to that? But they would submit themselves to it because they don't want to face the kind of like challenges of kind of like resource capture, policy capture, etc., etc. Why? Because they want to continue to operate. Sort of like fundamentally, companies' role is to make things and sell things. They want to limit any risks to their ability to do that. So anything which has a process which allows them to say, it's not us who are doing it. We've not just made this up. We're following a process that's endorsed by WaterAid, by WWF, by the Nature Conservancy, and so on and so forth. That's how we'll go for it. I think the challenge is kind of how do you make that a norm? So we have a real challenge in terms of kind of getting different companies to kind of commit to independent verification. I think we use the word private sector here a lot. It's that the private sector is a huge range of what it is. There's huge ranges both within sectors and scales and so on and so forth. And they all have their own cultures and kind of dynamics and relationships to water. So the ICT sector's relationship to water is very different to the agricultural sector, etc., etc. They react to kind of geopolitics. So kind of we work with a lot of ICT companies who make phones and computers and so on and so forth, but they're having to leave China for various reasons. They're having to leave China, they're having to move somewhere else. They're having to move somewhere else, but they need water. But at the same time, they also have climate commitments. So they move to hot places that they have challenges with water. So there's a whole kind of, it's just really complicated.
Yeah. in response to Nick's question that he threw out earlier about we've made these critiques, how do we really respond to it? I think one of the key aspects is how we grapple with the diversity, not just with the diversity of the private sector, but the diversity of the governments, the kinds of social contracts that we have between state and its people, the changing environment. I think that kind of diversity needs to be better understood. And I think, there's a tendency to simplify the narrative. I think there's a tendency to talk about productivity or efficiency as if it was a one-dimension definition. But I think moving forward, perhaps this dissonance is better unpicked if we understood how we can better communicate, better understand the diversity involved. With that note, I'm just going to ask if there are any final burning comments from our panel. I know there were a few more questions that came through the chat in the last minute, but our time is nearly running out. So I just want to give any reflections from the panel? Any?
Well, I'd just say there's a lot of dissonance, right? And I agree that it's difficult dissonance, but it's also creative dissonance. And I think, in a way, the UN conference was a useful amplifier of that dissonance. So I think it's kind of revealed it to an extent, and I think that's a very useful function of a conference like that. So I think we're in a good place now, but we need to follow up and be activist about our follow-up.
Okay. Lila, did you want to?
Yeah, I think it is a time of opportunity. The fact that there was this whole global attention on water and more on water, but let's bring it all together. Let's connect the dots, join the dots, make these connections. I think water folks have to talk outside the box, also reach out to other sectors and vice versa. And yeah, we really have to push because it's not looking good. I mean, for the planet, it's not looking good. And think about the billions who are just, lacking the most basic access. So we have a lot to do, and, let's carry on these conversations.
Yeah. Catarina, any final comments that you might want to have? Any final reflections?
Yes, I think it's, accountability. We kept talking about it, and accountability requires civil society engagement, and engagement needs to be paid for. And it's actually quite cheap compared with all the money and programs we're talking about. So wherever you're working, please keep pushing, advocating. We need to work with governments, global and national, but most important, we need to keep funding civil society to be able to engage in these discussions. So that's my pledge here to all of you who are here. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. It's great to end a webinar with a pledge like that. I think that shows commitment. But I really have to say thank you so much for the speakers, both in person and online, for starting this debate, and also for the in-person audience as well as the online audience. I think who have shown quite a lot of commitment towards how we can think about change, and really putting a little bit more detail to what we mean by acceleration or transformation. And I think that's really one of the first steps in moving forward. So it seems as though there will be more energy behind this in September. There'll be more events. So please do keep connecting with each other, and we look forward to seeing you at the next opportunity. Thank you so much, and goodbye for now. Bye-bye.